Well, gender is everything gender is everything that's not limited to the body. So it's a complex of behavioral features, mental qualities, and personal characteristics. So maleness, then, you're going to share it? Well, they're broadcasting here, probably not the screen, I hope. Maleness, then, is a physical quality, while masculinity, I would say, is sort of like a cultural or a spiritual one. Although, to be fully transparent, one is very highly correlated with the physical realities of being male. So they're different, but I would say that they're intimately connected. And regardless, because of that distinction, males are not always masculine, just as females are not always feminine. And a male must become what I would say sort of initiated into what we would call maybe the mysteries of masculinity, so to speak, in a sense, before he could become a man in the fullest sense of the word. And we can see this echoed across a number of different scientific disciplines that we're going to go through. So biology, developmental psychology, anthropology, all of these things sort of dive into this concept in more detail. And I'm not going to touch on when there's like a discordance between sex and gender and what leads to gender identity mismatch or transgender or anything like that. That's sort of outside the scope of this talk. But I do want to give us a better understanding of masculinity and hopefully shed some light and help us to answer this question of how to attain spiritual maturity of the heavenly man. So let's first talk about biology. One of the first classes I took in medical school was embryology. And embryology covers like the structural and molecular events from conception till about maybe 2 or 3 months out from of development, with sort of the layout of the body plan, how everything fits where, and then how they come together. And I have to say that was one of the hardest classes I ever took. I didn't find it particularly interesting. I thought it was very dense, so I didn't enjoy it that much. But one thing that I do remember from there is that the basic pattern of the human body is roughly female, meaning that the default was to develop into a female, and if there was no androgen, like testosterone, then the fetus develops into a female. So, for example, there's a condition called androgen insensitivity syndrome. And with that condition, what happens is the fetus is in fact male by virtue of the presence of a Y chromosome, but because of a defect in the receptors of androgen, the testosterone doesn't work. And so the fetus just basically develops like it would as a female. It never receives the chemical messaging it needs to develop into a male, so it defaults to a female. And so these are people who actually can grow up, they grow up as females because they look like females, they behave like females, up until it comes to puberty, and then they never have sort of their first period. And then only then do they realize that, there's this androgen insensitivity. Regardless, the presence of these male hormones develops the fetus into a male, and with it, there are some observed characteristics which help us to begin to formulate a picture of what it means to be masculine. Now, some of these characteristics, I'll say, are kind of hard to distinguish between as being innate from their biology or from psychological development, this concept of nature versus nurture. But whatever the case may be, these observations, I think, are important foundations for understanding sort of the masculine formation. So there was a book that was written by 2 developmental psychologists, Eleanor Maccabee and Carol Jacklin, and they identified at least 4 differences that appeared so early in childhood that they were considered to be innate or biological. Sure. Innate or biological. And these are just, by the way, observations. They're in no way 100%, but I think they give us some useful information about sort of this masculine formation. So the first observation was that girls have greater verbal abilities than boys. Okay? They were more fluent than boys consistently, and they were better at understanding difficult reading material and better at creative writing. Second observation they made was that boys excelled in visual spatial tasks, and that lead only grew over time, like in adolescence and things like that. The third thing was that boys excelled in math, which again increased over time during adolescence. And then the fourth observation that they made was that males were more aggressive, even from infancy, so very, very early on. Something about adrenaline and testosterone gives this sort of pleasurable high such that boys and men alike seek danger because it's enjoyable. And anybody here who has a son can probably attest to this. I can tell you, having both a son and a daughter, I can see a lot of these observations fairly clearly. There were other physical differences like greater upper body strength, higher ratio of muscle to body fat, etc. But like I said, these are not universal, so we should be clear on that. There were some females who were better at math, some females who were more aggressive than their male counterparts, or males who were better at verbal and creative writing. For example, they had a study in there of Harvard students whose fathers were absent due to their being sort of in the military or some other occupation like that. And they actually developed higher verbal profiles similar to that of their high-achieving female counterparts. Another study, which was of inner-city boys whose fathers were absent, showed very little tendency to excel in math. Okay, so many of these things are complicated, and there's other factors that go into it. But ultimately, what it tells us is that these qualities are less absolute certainties, and rather they're potentialities which can develop into favorable circumstances, whether to be good at math or visual, spatial, etc. Regardless, when we consider biology, these are some of the biological observations that were more commonly observed in the masculine and distinguish it from the feminine. What about beyond biology? So in the field or discipline of developmental psychology, which is really fascinating, by the way, and at its core, what it looks at is that what we experience in the first few months or years of our life gives us much of our personality traits and a framework by which we tend to classify and organize later experiences in life. And this is really complicated. There's a lot of patterns observed in those early years that lead to different things, like introvert versus extrovert, conflict seeking versus conflict avoiding. However, within that framework of developmental psychology, and at least maybe pertinent to the discussion of just gender identity, so there's a lot of things in developmental psychology, but just as we relate to gender identity and masculinity, we find one aspect of the early years to be really important, which is the relationship of the child, the developing child, to the mother. The mother is such an influential figure in the lives of children that it's sort of no surprise how important that becomes. Boys and girls have different developmental patterns because the girl is the same sex as the parent to whom she is closest, her mother, while a boy is a different sex from the mother and in some cases may never even know the father. Okay? And so as they develop their identities, a girl can model her identity after her mother, while for a boy, in a sense, he must almost reject his mother in order to attain to masculine. What does that mean? I don't mean it in a bad way that he's like disrespecting his mother or hating her or something like that. But in the process of differentiation and maturation in its most basic sense, the boy quickly learns that at the very least, his body is undeniably different than his mother. Okay? And the very body parts that confirm his male identity are the very ones that she does not have. Okay? There was a prominent developmental psychologist by the name of Irene Fast. She published a thesis called the Differentiation Model for Gender Identity, noting that this differentiation from the mother was key to masculine development, and furthermore must be accompanied by identifying with a male, okay, especially the father. And believe it or not, actually, when this separation doesn't happen, or this differentiation doesn't occur, and when the man has not successfully resolved issues of gender differentiation, it can actually lead to a variety of disorders. So, for example, they observed things like extreme misogyny, okay, where the female represents like the infantile or the childish part in a man, so he learns to hate it and dread it, and with it he learns to hate and dread women. Okay, another disorder that they observed in these patients was sadomasochism, which is a sort of sexual gratification from inflicting pain, either physical pain or psychological pain, on a woman. So these are disorders that have been observed and studied and shown to be associated with this lack of proper and usual gender differentiation. So that gender differentiation from the mother is really important. And so now we're beginning to see a pattern here about what defines masculinity. At its basic core, or at its most basic core, masculinity is characterized by separation, while femininity is characterized by communion. In the masculine, there is a separation of the ego from the world, and in the feminine, there is a continuous communion. And what's interesting actually is that no human being, all of us included, develops without having actually a little bit of both. I know we're talking about masculine and feminine, like, oh, you have to be all masculine, you have to be all feminine. That's not what we're saying here. What I'm saying here is that too much actually of either of these can be bad. So for example, in the pattern of masculine development, you have separation, but ultimately you actually have to have some sort of reunion, okay, which is a mix of masculine and feminine. And that's important because separation from the world by itself, that is unmitigated by communion, produces aggression and actually produces a more complete separation. And for men who fixate on separation only, they are more easily tempted by something like nihilism, okay, with this sort of final separation, which leads to suicide, okay? And it's not surprising then that men are four times more common to commit suicide than women, okay? And that's an important point to bring up here, and something that we'll see again as we see what other scientific disciplines have to say about masculinity, okay? So far we've covered the concept of masculinity through the lens of a couple of disciplines, biology and developmental psychology. What does anthropology tell us about the idea of masculine? Well, almost every society has developed some ideology of masculinity, a set of beliefs that's helped to define what does it mean to be a contributing man in society, okay? And these beliefs in many ways are designed to convince young boys to take on or undertake their roles in society. You know, as you grow older, these are the roles that you're supposed to take, and the roles are supposed to contribute to the betterment of society, even though those roles actually may oftentimes be dangerous. And in most human societies and in the cultural ideology of masculinity, a man must give up the state of boyhood in which he is, and this is a quote I'm reading here, a man must give up the state of boyhood in which he is protected by women, fed by women, and cared for by women, so that he may become a protector and provider for women and children. Okay, so said another way, he must give up being mothered before he can become a father. Okay? Now, regardless of whether this is something that you ascribe to or feel is applicable to you or your own set of beliefs, I'm just describing to you what anthropologists have observed in across cultures historically. And these are just observations made by experts in the field of anthropology based on aggregate data of hundreds of different cultures that span space and time. So in a sense, the anthropologic understanding of what it means to be masculine is two things. One, a man must be willing to fight and inflict pain, right? The men go off to war and they fight battles, things like that. But two, and perhaps maybe more importantly, he also must be willing to suffer and endure pain, okay? Oftentimes a young man will seek out dangers or tests of his courage, and he'll wear the scares of those adventures proudly, right? And ironically, this sort of affirmation of his masculinity is at the same time a form of self-abnegation, okay? This idea of always being ready to give up his life. Now, a woman has this same risk or danger, especially in childbirth, okay? Something that most, this idea of giving herself up for her child and for the propagation of the community. Again, we're talking about anthropology here, so just sort of roll with me for this, on this for a little bit. So she's giving herself up for the child and for the propagation of the community. While the man, he has no such opportunity unless he freely and willingly accepts danger. And that's something that most cultures will perceive as honorable. But to receive this honor comes with significant risk, not just of death, but of a number of different things. Every critical statistic in the areas of longevity, of disease, of suicide, of crime, accidents, childhood emotional disorders, alcoholism, drug addiction, all of those things show a disproportionately higher rate in males than in females. So men willingly take far more risks, whether that be in civilian occupations that are more dangerous or service in the military. Even men who don't necessarily describe themselves as being religiously or philosophically inclined, even men that aren't coming to a men's meeting to say, what does it mean to be masculine? Somehow, these same people are willing they're willingly and almost innately follow this path of self-sacrifice and regard it as a privilege. And so if you were to put together a sort of theory of masculinity based on what we've covered so far, you'll see that the masculine pattern is one of initial union in infancy, followed by separation, and then ultimately reunion with the family and with the community, with society. And while the feminine is characterized by a maintenance of that union or unity throughout their life. And this pattern is found on the biological level, found on the psychological level, and on the anthropologic level. And this theory of masculinity is then materialized in culture through an important concept called initiation. And this initiation is how you take concept and make it reality, how you take ideology of what it means to be masculine and what that means in practice. And this idea of initiation is kind of what I want to talk about for the second part of this discussion. So what is initiation? Many cultures have an initiatory ritual that recognizes boys as men after they have proved themselves as being able and willing to confront the dangers of life. Okay? Girls often, by the way, also have their own initiatory rituals or ceremonies that sees them go from girls to women, but that's, again, outside of the scope of the talk. But for boys, this initiation entails a three-part structure. First, there is a departure from the previous way of life. Two, there is a liminal period where you're sort of suspended between two worlds. You're not really a boy, not really a man. And then finally, number three is that you enter into a new way of life. Now, it's not overly complicated, but it is critical for masculine formation, and perhaps it's not too surprising that this initiation actually has very many similarities to religious initiation. Why are you laughing? I'm not telling you a joke. It's not funny. Just giving you a hard time. That's better. Yeah, that's what I want. No smiling. Okay. So, as I was saying, perhaps it's not too surprising that this initiation has many similarities to religious initiation. Right? Think about it. The initiate has to leave behind one world, be transformed, and enter into a new world in which he has a new status, a new name, even a new life. Now I can't even keep going. So a boy is reborn as a man in the same way that a believer is reborn as a new creation. And there are many examples of this sort of same tripartite structure in different cultures historically. When I was reading this, anybody ever see the movie 300? Right? So in 300, what happens? How does the boy get initiated? Right? They throw him out into the wilderness, and he has to, a wolf or something? Like he has to kill a wolf or something to that extent. Surviving in extreme temperatures. He has nothing but a hatchet or something to go out there with. And that's his initiation. When he comes back, he's then considered a man. He can enter into society. I remember that once we were taking a safari in Africa, and there's an area called the Serengeti, which borders between Kenya and Tanzania. And our tour guide was telling us about this tribe. Thought I had a slide in here. A tribe called the Maasai, where their initiation was that the boy had to go out and kill a lion and then bring that back to the tribal fathers, and that was his way of sort of proving himself to be a man, and that he could be initiated into it. Now, he was talking about in the context of the negative impact that had on wildlife, because we were there on a safari, we don't have lions because they're killing all our lions. So that's, not a good thing, but it was an important part of their initiation ritual, and it was what defined for them a boy as a man. And there's a lot of different examples, for instance, in historical literature. So if you look at literature, think about the genre of hero or heroic literature, which is in a very special way a dramatic or a dramatized manifestation of this pattern of masculine development by way of the literary hero. So what usually happens? The hero leaves normal life to confront, dangers and monsters and maybe even death itself. And he dies in a sense, but then he is reborn and he attains a wisdom that only comes with suffering, at which point then he can come and be reincorporated into the normal life and assume social responsibilities, whether it's like, he's now the king or he's the commander, what have you. And these are the types of stories that we see from authors like, Homer and the Odyssey, all the way up to, current day. Think about any Marvel movie, the hero sort of genre. But what does any of this theory of masculinity have to do with us as Christians? And what does the Bible say about it? Let's start with the Old Testament, and let's consider the biblical text, even if you forget about it as the Word of God. Let's just look about it from an anthropologic and as a literary source. What does it tell us about masculine? In the Old Testament, God is revealed to us as masculine. Okay, and notice that I'm not saying male, because like we said, maleness and masculine have two different meanings. Maleness refers to the body, but God doesn't have a body. Maleness refers to it's sexual, and God is not a sexual being. Okay, and by the way, this is in contrast to the other false gods of the ancient Near East. Like you ever read about in the Bible where they talk about Baal, like the false god Baal. Baal was a male deity, and he was the god of male fertility. And so the worship for this god was was sort of like sexual in nature. Okay, but this was never the case with God. But God revealed himself to us as masculine for a couple of reasons, if we take into consideration what we've talked about so far and what it means to be masculine. First, God transcends creation. Okay, it's not part of him, nor did it come out from him. Okay, he spoke and it came into being. And this is very different than the feminine, in which God would be immanent as opposed to being transcendent. There are plenty of feminine creation histories out there whereby the female deity gives birth to the world, okay, like Mother Earth or something like that. And the feminine creates with her body, while the masculine creates with his hands. The feminine is immanent and characterized by a communion, while the masculine is transcendent and completely other, completely separate. Okay? And he is therefore absolutely holy. Now, holy, in the truest sense of the word, actually is a masculine category. And by holy, I'm not talking about like the moral connotation of what we think of, like more holy means like, righteous and, holier than thou kind of thing. So I'm not trying to say that men are somehow more righteous than women. Instead, the original meaning of holy comes from something that is completely other or something that is transcendent. And the Hebrew word for it is kadosh, okay, which is where we get, right, in Arabic we say kudus, right? And the meaning of these words, again, is not so much the moral righteousness, but the idea of being separate. And even when it's translated into Aramaic, the word is translated as parisha, which means separated, and it's actually the same word from which we get Pharisee. So the idea of God as being holy or separate from his creation, with this understanding, sheds some light as to why he has revealed himself to us as masculine. And this separation is seen throughout creation. If you think about it, he separates the light from the darkness. He separates the waters above the heaven from the waters below on the earth. He uses the sun and the moon and the stars to make separate and distinct time intervals. Okay? He creates man and woman by separating Eve from Adam. Even when it says, I don't know if I have this. When it says in the Bible, it says, at the very beginning, it says, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be cleaved or united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. Okay? Notice that it is the man who must leave his father and mother. Okay, that's that separation before he can complete the cycle of reunion with his wife. Now, some people might argue that maybe it's just that in the Jewish culture that they were what's called matrilocal, that they lived next to the wife's family. There's no evidence to suggest, there's no anthropologic evidence at least to suggest that that was the case in Jewish culture, but rather it's that the man fulfills the masculine calling of separation in order to complete the cycle of reunion and reach the maturity of masculinity to which God has called him. And so in this context, the idea of separation becomes sort of very characteristic of the masculine. And particularly within Judaism, you see the birth of the idea of patriarchy. Now, some people sort of may be uncomfortable with this word or this concept. Okay, for many, the word patriarch is synonymous or has become synonymous with like male dominance or a system in which male traits are valued over female traits. Okay, and for others, it's a synonym for exploitation and domination. Okay, but the way that Judaism and the Old Testament perceived it as being established by Yahweh, okay, by God, argue that this was not the case. Or at the very least, if you don't agree with me on that, perhaps we can agree that it was not intended to be the case, even if somehow today or if some have sort of perverted it to their own intentions. So why do I say that? Is that patriarch, in the most basic sense, is a system in which fathers care for their families and they find their emotional centers in their children. Okay? And for the ancient Israelites, the image of father was not primarily one of authority and power, but one of adoptive love, of covenant bonding, of tenderness, of compassion. And I should mention, by the way, that this was a significant patriarchs here. I should mention that this was a significant break from the other pagan religions in the ancient Near East. Like if you look at some pagan myths of creation, the father god is usually characterized by like marginality, cruelty, oftentimes incompetence, okay, which then pose a danger for the other deities, like the children or the mother deities. So for example, there's, anybody have heard of the Enuma Elish? Enuma Elish? It's the Babylon, Enuma Elish. It's the story, the Babylonian creation story. Okay, it's something if you come across ancient Near East history, it's something you might see. But in that story, the father deity, his name is Apsu, he tries to kill his children deities. Okay, for no other reason than that they were basically making a lot of noise at night, and he couldn't sleep, and he was tired during the day, and so because of that, he goes out and tries to kill all his children. Okay, one of the children fights back and kills him. The mother deity then gets upset. So then one of the other children deities, Marduk, which is supposed to be that's their big one, comes out and kills her too. And that's, it sounds silly, but that's a perfect example of the perception of father that was typified by other pagan religions of the ancient Near East. Zeus from Greek mythology is another good example of that. But Yahweh was not like these irresponsible masculine gods of the surrounding pagan religions. He didn't abandon the children that he begot or want to kill them, but rather cared for them. And in Judaism, the patriarchs were called to reflect the fatherhood of God. Okay? In Jewish culture, the family was at the very heart of the Jewish way of life. Okay? The circumcision, the redemption of the firstborn son, the Passover meal, all of these things express the importance of fathers in culture, teaching us how to emulate our Father in heaven. Abraham was a terrific example of this. Think about the story of Abraham. He was first called to separate from his ancestral homeland and his father's house. When God makes a covenant with him, he, if you remember in Genesis, he has to cut an animal in two, put it on the sides, and then they walk through together. And that's how they established that covenant. The sign of the covenant was the circumcision, which is a literal separation of a piece of flesh from the body. When he goes to sacrifice Isaac, he's teaching his son how to take on the role of sacrificial masculinity, separating yourself from the world. And the significance of that only becomes fulfilled later on with Christ and the crucifixion. Moses is another good example. He was a patriarch who was also called to be separate. Right? First, he had to separate himself from the Egyptians and from the house of Pharaoh. He spent 40 years in the desert, emerging from it as a totally different person, okay? As a holy man of God. The Israelites were also called to be separate. When the plagues came to Egypt, the Israelites were always separate from the Egyptians, right? The hail doesn't kill the Israelites' cattle. The darkness doesn't envelop the land of Goshen, okay? And perhaps most importantly, The angel of death does not kill the Israelite firstborn when he sees the blood on the doorpost. Okay? The Red Sea separates to allow the people of Israel to go through, and it accomplishes that final separation between the Egyptians and the Israelites. And we could go on and talk about other patriarchs and how God called them to emulate him through this same type of separation, whether it's David or Elijah, Daniel, Isaiah. All of these have really good examples of separation. Even the people of Israel as a nation are called to be separate. Yeah. I really thought I had more slides in here. I keep looking for, I was like, I thought I put one in like this. I'll just read this to you, but the verse from Leviticus 20 says, "And you shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and have separated you from the people that you should be mine." Okay. Now we see the same theme continue to resonate. This is the last part I want to talk about. We see the same theme resonate within Christianity, which is the fulfillment of Judaism. Okay, the Christian, all of us, as sons of God, has a primarily masculine identity. Okay, follow me on this. Now we also say in Christ there is neither male nor female. So how is this possible? What it means is that regardless of being a man or a woman, all are called to be sons of God. And women are called to participate in this essentially masculine process of initiation and separation just as much as men are. Okay? What is this Christian initiation, and what relationship does it have to the separation that we already talked about that we said is sort of inherent to this masculine spirit? The initiation in the Orthodox Church always refers to the various actions of the church, such as like baptism, Eucharist, confirmation, laying of hands. And in the East, we always call these mysteries, or mysterion, right? This idea of a mystery emphasizes the concept of like a realm that transcends our everyday world. Now in the West, interestingly, we know in the West, what is it called? Sacraments, okay? And if you know where that comes from, there's the term comes from Latin, which is sacramentum, and actually has some military overtones. So it turns out that the word sacramentum in Latin was the oath that was sworn by the soldier when he was inducted into the army. Okay? He put aside all civilian matters and concerns and henceforth devotes his life entirely to military affairs. Okay? So you can see how this sort of mirrors the oath sworn by Christians as they enlist into the army of Christ. Okay? An oath that is brought to fruition through these sacraments or through these mysteries. It's interesting. One thing I found interesting, not that relevant to the topic here, but soldiers then, they would dismiss civilians in this sort of slang. And the term that they used, the slang term that they used was pagani. Pagani was essentially like hicks, okay, people that didn't enlist in the army. And then Christians took that term over to describe those who had not enlisted in the army of Christ, pagans. Okay, so I thought that was kind of interesting. Not relevant, but something interesting to know. The mystery or the sacrament of baptism is a perfect example of this because it represents everything that we just discussed, and it's sort of the epitome of this sort of initiation. In baptism, the believer descends into the abyss, confronts death, and literally dies, only to be reborn to a new life. So when we are conformed to his death and resurrection, which is accomplished through baptism and confirmation, we are reborn. And that sounds very similar, in fact, mirrors a lot of what we talked about, this sort of masculine development discussed earlier. And again, this initiation here is clearly a calling for men and women. Okay, we're not talking about sex, we're talking about the masculine formation that we're all called to take on. Now, beyond baptism, the early church practiced this initiation in a very real sense through martyrdom, okay, which is a sort of baptism by fire. In martyrdom, the Christian is not simply a student of Christ, but a disciple, somebody who emulates or imitates Christ. And if the key event in the life of Christ is his death and resurrection, then we too are called to be fully conformed to that death and resurrection. Okay? Contemplate on any of the lives of the saints. Polycarp of Smyrna, St. Ignatius of Antioch, St. George, St. Philibert. These martyrs were quite literally soldiers in the army of Christ who willingly sought out the opportunity to witness to Christ. Okay? sacrificing themselves in order to protect and grow the community. Okay, think about that in what we talked about from an anthropologic standpoint, the idea of protection in order to propagate the community. And Tertullian, he said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Okay? After the age of martyrs, we have the monks that became sort of the new athletes of Christ. St. Athanasius says that the martyrs were consummated in a battle lasting only for a moment, but the monastic institute obtains martyrdom by means of a daily struggle. Okay? And this was what was referred to as the white martyrdom, as opposed to like the red martyrdom because of bloodshed. You know, Anthony, St. Anthony, literally battles demons, okay, in the desert who come to fight him. And this idea of a warrior in battle sort of typifies the heroic motif, right, the hero literature that we talked about earlier. Even if you think about the initiation of a monk, anybody ever see a monk get ordained before? What do they do for that ordination rite? The monk literally lies down, they cover him with a sheet, or they cover him with some sort of, the ones I saw, they took like a thin rug, basically, and they covered him. And they pray, so he's supposed to resemble a corpse, and they're praying a funeral prayer over him, okay? And when he arises at the end of that prayer, he is given a new name, a new identity, new clothes, okay? So everything about him is different from before. That's a perfect example of this initiation, this death and then rebirth. And this is why if we can understand, what I want to finish with is that if we can understand masculinity in the way that God has ordained it, not in the ways that others have perverted it or in the way that it may be perceived by the world, but in the way that it was originally designed, then we can truly understand the heavenly man. The heavenly man is the one who is willing to separate and be holy as God was holy. The heavenly man is the one who is willing to die, to descend into the abyss and battle demons. The heavenly man is the one who has answered this call to enlist in the army of God. The heavenly man is the one who, like an athlete, he runs the race so that he can attain the prize. And the heavenly man, finally, is the one who is willing to be conformed to his death so that we might attain to the resurrection from the dead. And honestly, I can't think of a better season of the church right now than right now to meditate on these things and on these principles. Lent is that time of struggle and self-discipline. And I think about, Mark sent out this good article in the WhatsApp chat a couple months ago now, I think. It was about like why Orthodox men, why Orthodox men love church or something like that, or why men love the Orthodox church, something like that. And if you read through it, it's very interesting. A lot of it comes from people not cradle Orthodox like us, but people who converted. And a lot of the things that they comment on, you'll find these common themes of like a warrior or an athlete, okay? The idea of being challenged in a way that they hadn't been challenged before. Sometimes those challenges are actual physical challenges, like, the struggle to stand up for the duration of the liturgy, or the struggle to stand up during prayer, or the struggle to fast for hours on end, prostrations, staying up late at night, waking up early in the morning. These challenges were, the physical challenges. Then there are the struggles of the mind, resisting temptation. The book of Hebrews talks about, you have not yet resisted even to the point of bloodshed. So these ascetic practices and this idea of challenging us resonates with us as men because it mirrors and reflects the masculine formation of where we're called to be separate and holy. And it reflects the initiation process that we spoke about before, sort of death of the will, which then comes to fulfillment, to fruition in Holy Week. That's when we descend into that abyss, when we are conformed to the death of Christ, only so that we may be resurrected with him as a new creation. And that's how we attain the spiritual maturation that Christ has planned for each and every one of us. One thing that Buna Sam said in a recent talk, he said, and we talked about this before, Mark, I'm trying to think of the quote. It said, good times bring strong men. Strong men bring good times. Good times bring weak men. Weak men bring bad times. And then and then the cycle repeats. Okay, did I get it right? Do you know what I'm talking about or no? Okay. So, point is, he was talking about this in the context of Pope Kyrillos. As we know, before the time of Pope Kyrillos, the church was going through a hard time. And so because of that hard time, there were people that stood up and really wanted to bring about change in the church and make it into a strong church. And I think that we are now living in that sort of good time. But as we said, if the cycle continues, those good times bring about weak men. And weak men then bring about bad times. So are we going to be willing to break that cycle and bring about and keep it in the good times that we're at right now, in the strength of the church, in the initiation that we talked about before, or not? As was the man of dust, so also are those who are made of dust, and as is the heavenly man, so also are those who are heavenly. And as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly man. Glory be to God forever. Questions? Comments?
With the creation, you mentioned that, like from the beginning, that God revealed himself as a masculine. However, if you go literally, he revealed himself as plural.
Revealed himself as what?
Plural.
Plural. Yes.
So is this a transformation?
Yeah, in creation he revealed himself as plural, which the church always interpreted as a manifestation of the Trinity. In Judaism, they took a couple of different understandings of it, that the plural was, when he said, like, let us make man in our image, some people think that it was him talking to the other angels, like talking to them, but that doesn't quite make sense because our image, it's not in the angels' images, it's in God. Another understanding of it was that he was speaking to like wisdom personified. Let us make man in our image. I'm just telling you what sort of Jewish scholarship says about it. Thank you. But even aside from the plural, when he introduces there, all of the Old Testament always talks about God in the masculine. And again, like we said, it's not because God is male or female, but in the way that he has revealed himself to us through his word, this is how he was always referred to, as a he. Okay? So it's not, again, just want to make sure that it's clear that, and the idea of it being masculine is more about him being separate and holy, and not about, being male or female. So just want to make sure that's clear. But does that answer your question, Sharif, about the plural?
I'm thinking about something else. Like, God revealed himself as plural to involve both the masculine and feminine nature as an initial revelation, and then afterward he is revealing more the masculinity to separate from the pagan world or from the other world. And another step, he reveals the femininity in the form of the church.
Yeah.
Coming back.
But when he said, like, if you're saying at the beginning when he says, "Let us create man in our image," I don't think that, I've never heard it to interpret as that he was encompassing both masculine and feminine. Although I have read in some places that maybe when he created man, it wasn't until he created woman that you see this distinction of man and woman. And some of the old Hebrew texts, if you translate directly, suggest that the first word for man was actually just mankind, and then he separated man and woman, and that's how you have the two sexes. But in terms of how God revealed himself to us, I will say that he does have, and some of the readings talk about this, that he has components of masculine and feminine, in a sense. So he is masculine, like for all the reasons that we talked about, transcendence, and it's holy, it's separate. But he also encompasses some of that communion with his creation, that He is with us and all around us, inside of us. The kingdom of God is inside of you. All those things that we talked about, and even in many examples in the Old Testament, he'll compare himself as to a mother, right? So God is complete in everything. That he carries with him also some of the feminine within him, but we've never referred to him as her or she, right? It's just and even when we talk about children of God, it's primarily as sons of God. So when we say masculine, and I just want to make sure this is clear because I don't want it to come away as saying this is a pro-man talk and go men. I'm just talking about if masculine is offensive to somebody, you could just as they say separation and home. That's the key message of God, is that he always called us to be separate from the world, okay, and to be holy. And masculinity, for all the reasons that we talked about, if you just follow the natural course of masculinity, it mirrors some of those same things. That young boys are called to be, to separate from their families and then be reinitiated. So that separation is really the key thing that I wanted to highlight. So hopefully that's clear. Other questions? Anybody? You have a question?
Thank you, Ehab. I had a comment and a question. I think, I wonder if when you hear something like, well, God created us, and we are called to separate and come back, and this is a masculine characteristic, or part of the definition of what it means to be masculine. Are we, if you hear that, and then if you become uncomfortable with that concept, let's say, or you feel that, well, what does that mean for myself in masculine terms as it relates to, the feminine or the opposite sex? And I wonder if the way we automatically view what it means to be a man or masculine in this day and age, like we don't appreciate the differences and what God reveals to us in the differences between the sexes. You know what I mean? I don't know if that's clear. Like it's like we almost look at it as, well, if it's always it's a comparison when it really shouldn't necessarily be a comparison, as more of you need both to complement and to form what God intended for a unified humanity to be. Like I heard Father Hans, when he came last year, he was saying how, I don't know if he said this to the group or not, but he was saying how if you look at the way God created humanity, he creates man with this desire and this innate desire to build or to create something, right? And like you and I were talking about this just last week, when you're just sitting at home and you're not doing anything, you're just vegging out, you almost feel useless. Like you have to do something. And he created man to like build a house, and then he created woman to fill it with life. And you need both. You can't have one or the other, and it's not who's better or who's, it's not a comparison. It's you just need both, and they both have different roles.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that, and I think what's important about it is I think it plays at the strengths of each person. Like we said, masculine and feminine are different from male and female. There are some men who have more feminine characteristics, and there are some women who may have more masculine tendencies as well. So it's not about sort of one being for the other, but there are certain things that if these are the strengths of men or a man, that's okay. I think we spend a lot of time, especially these days, trying to define the roles, and they weren't always defined. They weren't always they didn't have definitions or words to put to it. It just sort of came about. Now, sometimes, like I said, in a lot of ways, these things can be misused, and we see examples of that. And in some way, we're paying for that now in the way that people misuse either their masculinity or their femininity. And so you see an age of sort of moral relativism where nothing is right, everything is right, nothing is wrong, or whatever you ascribe to. But I think, to your point before, I think that there's a complementary nature for masculine and feminine coming together, and I think that's important to understand. We said earlier how if you have too much of one or the other, that can be dangerous. If you have too much of the masculine, totally unmitigated by feminine, that can lead to that complete separation, and in many cases, suicide. And there was one passage I came across that said that Satan actually is an example of the 100% pure masculine. He is the complete separation with no hope for communion or reunion ever. And that's obviously not, we're not called to do that or to be that. So in the same way God is characterized by the masculine, but obviously has some of that feminine as well. We are called to mirror and reflect that, men and women alike, to the masculine call of separating ourselves and being called to be holy and to die with Christ and be resurrected with him. It's not a male thing. It may be a masculine thing, but it's not a male thing. And it needs also to be accompanied by that, the feminine, which is that communion, reuniting with the church, okay, with Christ, being resurrected. And that's how we can come to fill those roles that we're called to do.
Do you think we in this generation are not separating and coming back the way we're supposed to? Like not living a life of self-sacrifice that we are called to live? I don't know if anyone has any thoughts. Listen.
Stay with me. I think we are not doing it intentionally. And we need to be more aware, more conscious about what we ought to do or what we should do. And every day we have the choice to separate and come back on different levels. And as I said, many of developmental problems come from the lack of separation and coming back. And you mentioned sadomasochism. It's very interesting in developmental psychology that it's a way to punish a partner or punish the person himself because he cannot achieve this separation and coming back.
Exactly.
It's very complex.
It's very complex, I know, and I sort of only give a snippet of it, and I'm in no way an expert on it, but I thought it was interesting. I think it just shows that differentiation is important. It needs to be, you need to have that complete separation, in order to have an appreciation for the family. I liked the idea of coming back, like if you look at hero literature, the idea of separating, but then being reunited and coming back into society, taking on these different roles, And you see this a lot of times, I think about even maybe a lot of us might be able to, maybe this resonates with a lot of us about how our own sort of growth, I remember a time in my life where I needed to separate myself in order to grow, and then after that growth, it was easier for me to come back and really, take on responsibilities. There was a point in my life, at least, where the church of my father became my church. You know what I mean? Like the God of my father is becoming my God. So there's that process of initiation, I think, is really important. We talked about, I was telling you in the beginning just about, scientifically, apart from any sort of religious overtones, just about what that separation looks like in biology, developmental psychology, and the sort of the things that can happen if those things don't go right. And those same pitfalls can happen in our spiritual growth too. That if we don't have that separation from the world, in the same way that a child doesn't have the separation, let's say, from his mother, it doesn't allow for proper formation, masculine formation or Christian formation. That's sort of the main thing. It's very interesting. I think there's a lot of things that you could go on and on about how that, the two are mirrored from each other, they reflect each other, and why it's important to achieve that process in both aspects.
So something you mentioned, they have that the strength of the masculine resonate more with the spiritual struggle. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So does that mean spiritual struggle is, on average or generally, harder for females?
No. I think that it's something that might resonate more easily with males. But in the same way, for instance, there's this concept of us as being the bride of Christ, which we're called to be the brides of Christ. Some people would argue that it's really the church that's called to be the bride of Christ, not so much each individual believer, but there's some that say also the believer. We're called to be the bride of Christ. Again, that's a motif and an understanding that's more naturally understood by the feminine more than the masculine. It's hard for me to imagine myself as the bride of Christ, just being a man. Okay, but we're still called to be that, to fulfill that role. And I think in the same way that maybe that might be a little bit more difficult for us to understand, doesn't mean that we're less called to do it. Same thing I think for the feminine to be called to sort of struggle. But I think it's just, if I could add one thing to it, I think it is just as, I wouldn't say it's easiest. It's not easy for either. But it's like if you go to the gym, if you have the guy who's ripped and he's lifting 400 pounds versus somebody who's not and they're lifting 50 pounds. But it's just as difficult for each person. In fact, if the one that's doing 400 pounds, maybe on average they lift 600. I'm making up numbers here. Mika's looking at me like you're crazy. Maybe Mika lifts 600, but for the rest of us who can only lift 50 pounds, even if it's just, if he lifts a 400 and he's used to lifting 600, then that may not really be a struggle for him. So I think the idea of struggle, I don't know if it's necessarily more foreign to the feminine than to the masculine, but it's certainly, I think, more characteristic of the masculine, I would say. But both are called to it.
I see.
Both men and women are called to it as being a sort of primarily masculine trait.
There's a verse I just want to mention that might be related. It's 1 Corinthians 16:13. So in English it says, "Watch, stand fast in the faith, be brave, be strong." The Arabic translation is interesting.
Okay.
It says, "اسهروا اثبتوا في الإيمان كونوا رجالا."
Be men.
تقوا. Yes. So in Arabic it says "be men." This is the words in Arabic, right? The English translation does not say that. It says, at least according to NJKV or whatever, "Be brave, be strong." Interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, it's a good example of the things that we traditionally ascribe to the masculine, and that being part of that Christian calling. And I think it just exemplifies sort of, I think, what we were talking about earlier. Again, if that passage is in the Bible, right, and men and women are supposed to read it and abide by it. So to me, it confirms or affirms that this sort of masculine calling really is not meant for men alone. It's men and women, that we're all called to be sons of God. And that's important. I think that's something that we can... So I wanted to make sure that in this discussion that we made sure it's not supposed to be about men over women. That's why I made it very clear at the beginning about masculine versus feminine. And I hope that was clear and nobody comes away with the wrong impression here. But there's a men's group, and I wanted something that I thought would resonate with us as men. And I think that's, hopefully that's helpful for us to understand. And again, one last thing I'll say is that when you looked at, like, for instance, Jewish culture, I like this idea of, becoming fathers. Like, that's sort of to be able to be, that's how you come back, that reunion with the family, whether it's like your own personal family or like the family of the church. You're coming back to guide others, sort of instruct others, and that's sort of that fatherhood, and that's sort of what we're called to emulate. God as our Father, so we're called to be as fathers.
The word that you mentioned in Greek is act like men, and the word in Greek is from androgen.
Be like men. The Arabic's got it is more accurate. The English is the 21st century version. Politically correct. Yeah.
Just about that, also sharing a little experience. I just came from the convent.
Yeah.
With the middle schoolers.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely have seen nuns that, I mean, according to this verse, would qualify more men than myself and many other men I know. So.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely, it's neither male nor female. It's a calling for all of us as Christians. That's the most important thing.
The very way that we were created, in a way that the woman who gives the childbearing member of the marriage, again, kind of thinking out of this, not spiritual. We found the separation technologically just can't happen in a way that.
Like the man can't achieve that same.
Yeah, otherwise the human race will crumble.
Yeah.
And then just it's another point that it's like we have different roles for certain house of this creation. But all of us are necessary.
Yeah, one thing that came across that was interesting is that, if you forget human beings, if you just look at other species, the male's role in reproduction is like nothing, right? And then the male's gone, oftentimes. Yeah. And so it's up to the female to propagate that. So in human society, specifically within Judaism, creating this idea of patriarchy, again, thinking about it in the way that God intended patriarchy, not in the way that we sometimes misuse it now, but was actually sort of a big accomplishment if you think about it, because the natural tendency of the male is to be gone, to be absent. Patriarchy establishes us then to come back to be reunion as that father, and to come back and again, the family being the center of the Jewish culture, the church being the center of the Christian faith. So, to go, reproduce and be gone, that's like the natural way. That's like if we had no inhibitions, that's what we would do. But we are called to come back to be reunited and put in our part, from a cultural level, as opposed to, the woman is involved, throughout, but the man doesn't have to be, unless he is called in the same way that God has called us to be these fathers.
Concept of separation, and maybe it's just me who's had this thought in the past, but it's like you're always thinking about, and we kind of talked about it with this like concept of the hero who, goes on the journey or whatever and comes back, but it's almost like a one point in time, where like he was a boy, and then this happened, and then was a man, and I think the concept that you're talking about today is like, well, it's really a daily separation, right? It's like a moment by moment. It's a constant dying and ascending and raising.
Yeah, in many ways, it's a simultaneous separation and communion. I think maybe it's on different levels, because I can certainly think of a very distinct separation period in my life and a reunion period in my life, and that's sort of on a macro level. And then thinking about it from a daily perspective, yes, there's also separation. Maybe, you could almost think about it like we're called to spend some time, in the inner room, right, with Christ. Matthew chapter 6, we're called to pray to him. That maybe is that part of the daily separation. And then we come back, like, when the priest, for instance, is called to nourish his congregation, right? But he can only nourish his congregation if he himself is nourished. So and servants were also called to do the same thing, but I'm just using the priest as an example. But they spend that time of separation, so to speak, from the world. They are nourished, and then they come back to assume that daily responsibility of feeding the rest of us that need to be fed. And so I like what you're saying. I think there's that there may be a distinct time period on one level of, union, separation, reunion, but then even on a daily struggle, in the sense of a daily struggle, there's also the daily life, how we fulfill that.
Thank you. This is the application we're looking for.
Stand up to pray. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, deliver us from evil. Christ Jesus our Lord, thine is the kingdom,